The air in Blackwood, Massachusetts was a thick, humid blanket, a leftover from a summer that refused to die. It clung to the old clapboard houses, to the moss-covered stones of the local cemetery, and to the sweat-slicked brow of Detective Thomas Riley. He stood in the cluttered office of the town's historical society, the smell of dust and old paper a sharp counterpoint to the impending storm outside. The case he was investigating, the bizarre disappearance of a local historian, Elias Thorne, was a knot he couldn't seem to untangle. The Historical Society's office was a monument to Blackwood's past, a place where time had been meticulously preserved and catalogued. Rows of leather-bound journals and brittle photographs lined the shelves, and a large wooden desk in the center of the room was piled high with research notes, books, and an open ledger. Elias Thorne had been a meticulous man, a guardian of Blackwood's grim history, and his sudden vanishing was as out of place as a neon sign in a graveyard. Riley's partner, Detective Lena Ortiz, a woman whose cynicism was only matched by her sharp wit, was on the other side of the desk, sifting through a stack of old newspapers. "Anything?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Just more of Thorne's obsession," she said without looking up. "He was deep into this killer widow story, said it was the key to Blackwood's dark heart." Riley sighed, running a hand over his tired face. The story of the killer widow, a woman who had supposedly married and murdered dozens of men in the mid-19th century, was a local legend. A grim tale passed down through generations, often dismissed as morbid folklore. He'd seen the notes. Thorne had been convinced it was all true, a dark secret buried beneath the town's quiet facade. "A legend, Lena. People disappear. They get in trouble. It's not a ghost story." "Tell that to the 47 men who supposedly married her," Lena shot back, finally looking at him. Her eyes, normally filled with a weary professionalism, held a glint of genuine intrigue. Thorne's notes say only 2 survived. He was convinced she was real, not just a myth. He called her Eleanor Vance. Riley shook his head. "We've got a missing person, not a historical conspiracy. Focus on the present. Was there anyone he was arguing with? Anyone he mentioned?" Just then, his eyes fell upon a small silver locket lying on the floor, half hidden by the leg of a chair. He crouched down, picking it up. It was heavy and intricately carved with a twisting vine-like pattern. He flicked it open. Inside, on one side, was a faded sepia-toned photograph of a stern-faced woman with a severe bun and sharp, intelligent eyes. On the other side was a single lock of raven-black hair tied with a thin crimson ribbon. "Find anything?" Lena asked, walking over to him. "Just this." He held out the locket. "It was on the floor. It looks old." Lena took it, her brow furrowed. "Looks like something Thorne would have. Maybe a research piece." She turned it over in her hands, her expression shifting from indifference to a sudden, chilling stillness. "Look at this." She pointed to the back of the locket. There, etched into the silver, were 2 sets of initials, E.V., and a date, 1842. "Eleanor Vance," Lena whispered. "This is real." He found something. A new wave of unease washed over Riley. The rational part of his brain screamed it was a coincidence, a piece of historical trivia. But the sight of the locket, the palpable weight of its age, and the chilling inscription made him feel as though he was holding a piece of a story that was still being written. The details Thorne had obsessed over, the multiple marriages, the sudden deaths, the survivors, began to feel less like folklore and more like a macabre pattern. He and Lena returned to the desk, poring over Thorne's disorganized notes. The deeper they went, the more they realized Thorne wasn't just a historian. He was a detective in his own right, meticulously connecting dots that spanned over a century. He had uncovered birth records, marriage licenses, and death certificates, all pointing to a single terrifying conclusion. This wasn't a legend. It was a true crime case from the 19th century that had been buried by time and rumor. "He was close to something big," Riley said, his voice quiet. He picked up one of Thorne's notebooks. The handwriting was a frantic scrawl, a stark contrast to the historian's usual neatness. The last entry was a single, disturbing sentence. "She's here. I think she knows I'm getting too close." A cold dread settled in Riley's stomach. The storm outside finally broke, rain hammering against the windows, a dramatic accompaniment to the chilling discovery. The town of Blackwood, with its quiet streets and picturesque New England charm, suddenly felt like a stage for a very old and very real kind of horror. It wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was an investigation into a past that was refusing to stay buried. And if Thorne's final words were true, that past had a name, and it was still watching. The rain of the previous night had given way to a crisp, cold morning, a stark change that mirrored the unsettling shift in the investigation. Riley and Lena stood outside Elias Thorne's dilapidated Victorian house, a monument to a past that was both a passion and a prison for its owner. The place was a fortress of history, its windows like vacant staring eyes, its facade peeling and faded. A single cracked pane in an attic window caught Riley's attention. They had already searched the main living areas, finding them tidy but devoid of any recent activity. The real story, they suspected, was hidden in the details. The front door creaked open, and a young woman stepped out, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She was Thorne's niece, Clara, a nervous art history student who had been helping her uncle catalog his more recent acquisitions. "Did you find anything, detectives?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "We're still looking, Miss Thorne," Riley said gently. "Your uncle's research. Was he ever secretive about it?" Clara wrung her hands. "Secretive? No, not exactly. But he was obsessed, especially lately. He'd talk about this woman, Eleanor Vance. He said she was a master manipulator, that her victims were just as much a part of her story as she was. He was trying to figure out how she chose them." She paused, her gaze drifting to the attic window. "He spent most of his time up there. The attic. It was his sanctuary. He wouldn't let anyone else in." A new piece of the puzzle fell into place. The attic. Riley and Lena exchanged a look. "Would you mind if we took a look up there, Miss Thorne?" Riley asked. Clara nodded, her hands still trembling. I'll show you the way." The attic was a dusty, cavernous space, a repository of Blackwood's forgotten memories. Old furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghosts, and the air was thick with the scent of age and decay. A single bare light bulb cast long, dancing shadows. In the center of the room was a large wooden desk, a mirror image of the one at the Historical Society, piled high with books and papers. The floor was a chaotic mosaic of newspaper clippings, ledgers, and maps, a testament to Thorne's frantic research. Lena's eyes scanned the room, settling on a wall covered in a sprawling, hand-drawn timeline. It charted marriages and deaths, names and dates, all connected by a web of red string. At the center of it all was a name: Eleanor Vance. "Look at this," Lena said, her voice a low gasp. He wasn't just tracking a story. He was tracking a person, a single individual who moved through the country for decades, leaving a trail of dead men in her wake. Riley walked over, his eyes following the string, from Massachusetts to New York, then down to Ohio, and finally to a small, obscure town in Colorado. The pattern was horrifyingly consistent. A woman arrives, a wealthy bachelor marries her, and a few months later, he dies of a sudden, unexplained illness. The name on the marriage certificates was always Eleanor Vance, but the details of her life, her age, her background, even her appearance, shifted slightly with each new marriage. She was a chameleon, a master of disguise and deceit. How did she get away with it? Riley muttered, more to himself than to Lena. That's what Thorne was trying to figure out, Lena said, pointing to a stack of journals. He was focused on her motivation. He wrote here that she didn't seem to be after money. The men she married weren't all wealthy. Some were, but others were just average guys. And the money she inherited? It was always used to buy land, small plots here and there. He couldn't figure out why. Riley picked up one of the journals. The last entry was dated the day Thorne vanished. The motive is not greed. It's something else. Something far more sinister. I think I've found a connection to her survivors. The mention of survivors sent a jolt through Riley. The two men who had lived. Thorne had been trying to find them. He'd meticulously cross-referenced his findings with census data and old town records. He had even, a note revealed, tried to track down their descendants. He was looking for a pattern, a psychological link, Riley said, scanning the pages. Why those two men and not the others? What did they have in common? Was it a mistake? A conscious choice? The floor creaked behind them. They both spun around. Clara stood in the doorway, her face a mask of terror. "What's wrong, Miss Thorne?" Riley asked. "The locket," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Riley's pocket. "That locket, it was my grandmother's. My uncle found it in her belongings when she passed away last year. He said it was the key to everything." A chill ran down Riley's spine. The locket, a piece of the past, now a part of the present. But it was the other detail that truly froze him. Thorne's grandmother. He quickly flipped through Thorne's notes. He had drawn a rough family tree, a simple tracing of his lineage. Riley followed the line, his finger stopping at the name of Thorne's great-grandmother, a name he recognized from the historical documents, a name that, according to Thorne's research, was a known associate of Eleanor Vance in the 1850s. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Elias Thorne wasn't just a historian, he was a potential victim. He was a descendant of someone who had known the killer widow. A terrible thought took root in Riley's mind. Was this a coincidence, or was Thorne's disappearance the latest chapter in a century-old story of manipulation and death? He looked around the attic at the tangled web of string and names. He was no longer just investigating a disappearance. He was standing on the precipice of a century-old mystery that was reaching out from the grave to claim its next victim. The locket in his pocket felt heavier now, its cold metal a constant reminder of the chilling connection. Riley and Lena left the Thorne house, their conversation hushed, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. The investigation was no longer a puzzle, it was a ghost hunt for a very real, very human monster. The next logical step was to follow Thorne's final lead, the two survivors. Thorne had identified them as Daniel Sterling and Jacob Finch. Their descendants, if they still existed, were their only hope of understanding Eleanor Vance's method and, by extension, finding Thorne. Their search led them to the Blackwood Library, a quiet, stately building that felt like an oasis of calm in the rising tide of their panic. They pored over old town records, obituaries, and phone books. Their efforts led them to a woman named Margaret Sterling, a direct descendant of Daniel Sterling, one of the two survivors. Margaret was an elderly woman, a retired schoolteacher who lived in a small, well-kept cottage on the outskirts of Blackwood. She greeted them with a gentle smile, her hands gnarled with arthritis but her eyes clear and sharp. She listened patiently as Riley explained their purpose, her expression shifting from polite interest to a somber, knowing sadness. "My grandfather, Daniel. He never spoke about it much," she began, her voice a soft, dry rustle like turning pages. He said he met her in Boston. She was a beautiful, refined woman. He was a young man then, a successful merchant. He courted her for a year, and they were to be married. But something happened. He called off the engagement suddenly and returned to Blackwood. He never married anyone else. Did he ever say why? Lena pressed, leaning forward. Margaret shook her head. No, not directly. But I remember a story he told me once. It was late at night and he had been drinking. He said he had a dream, or maybe it was a premonition. He said Eleanor was like a flower, beautiful and fragrant on the outside, but her roots were in the soil of the dead. He said she was a cultivator of despair. Riley felt a shiver run down his spine. A cultivator of despair. What do you think he meant by that? I don't know. It was just an old man's rambling. But I remember something else. He was a skilled gardener. He had a greenhouse behind the house. He would spend hours out there, meticulously caring for his plants. But he would never ever plant nightshade. He was terrified of it. He said it was the devil's plant, that it was meant to be admired but never touched. The word nightshade hit Riley like a lightning bolt. He pulled out Thorne's notes from his pocket, the one he had transcribed from the Historical Society. Thorne had been researching common poisons of the 19th century. One of the pages was dedicated to a specific type of deadly nightshade, Atropa belladonna. The symptoms Thorne had listed, fever, hallucinations, and a slow, painful paralysis, matched the descriptions of the sudden, unexplained illnesses that had claimed the lives of Eleanor's victims. Thorne was right, Lena said, her voice filled with a grim sense of triumph. She didn't need magic or supernatural powers. She used poison, a botanical killer. But the next piece of information from Margaret Sterling was even more chilling. My grandfather. He always said that Eleanor Vance had a special kind of memory. She never forgot a person or a kindness or a slight, and she had a deep connection to her family. He said she never spoke of them, but you could see it in her eyes. It was like she was a part of a much bigger story. Riley's mind went back to the family tree Thorne had drawn, the one that showed a connection between his own great-grandmother and Eleanor Vance. It wasn't just a coincidence. Thorne was a descendant of someone who had known her. But why was he a target? Did your grandfather, or anyone in your family, ever have any dealings with a man named Elias Thorne? Riley asked. Margaret's face clouded over. Oh, yes. Elias came to me a few months ago. He said he was a historian, and he wanted to know everything my grandfather ever told me about Eleanor Vance. I told him the story about the nightshade and the roots in the soil. He seemed very agitated by it. He said it was a crucial detail. Did he mention anything about his own family? Lena asked. Margaret hesitated, her gaze drifting to a small framed photograph on a nearby table. It was a picture of a woman from the late 19th century, her face serene and her hair pulled back in a tidy bun. He said he was a part of her story too. He didn't say how, and I didn't press him. He just looked at me and said, Some families have a debt to pay." The cryptic words hung in the air, a chilling portent. Riley felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. The motive wasn't just poison and manipulation. It was something deeper, something passed down through generations. A debt. Could Eleanor Vance's actions be a part of a family vendetta? A twisted, century-long plan for revenge? The true horror of the case was beginning to reveal itself. It wasn't a single act of evil, but a legacy of it. A thread of darkness that connected the past to the present, and which had now ensnared Elias Thorne. The killer widow wasn't just a person. She was a terrible tradition. The trail of breadcrumbs left by Elias Thorne grew more intricate with each step. Margaret Sterling's revelation about the nightshade and the concept of a debt had cracked the case wide open, but it had also raised a chilling new question. Was this a solo act of murder, or was it a family enterprise? Riley and Lena returned to Thorne's attic, now a grim crime scene, to re-examine the historical artifacts with their new perspective. This time, their focus wasn't on the victims, but on Eleanor Vance herself and any possible Confederates. They sifted through the old town records Thorne had collected, looking for any mention of family, of siblings or children. The old documents were frustratingly sparse, but a pattern began to emerge. Eleanor had 2 younger sisters, both of whom had lived and died in Blackwood. They had never married, and they had died young, both from sudden unexplained illnesses, much like Eleanor's victims. Thorne had marked their names with a small cryptic S on his family tree chart. Survivors? Riley wondered, but then dismissed it. They were victims, not survivors. They were just part of the same terrible hidden pattern. As they dug deeper, Lena found a small, rolled-up parchment tucked inside a leather-bound book. It was a hand-drawn map of Blackwood from the 1860s, a topographical survey of the land. It wasn't a document from the Historical Society. It was a personal item, a secret. Dotted across the map, in faint, almost invisible ink, were tiny, meticulously drawn circles, each one marked with an X. Riley and Lena compared it to Thorne's records. Each X corresponded to the location of a small plot of land that Eleanor Vance had purchased after the death of one of her husbands. He said she used the money to buy land. Lena said, her voice a hushed whisper. Not for profit, not for a home. She was collecting them. Collecting what? Riley asked, his eyes tracing the faint, almost ghostly circles. Just then he noticed a small, folded piece of paper tucked into the corner of the map. He carefully unfolded it. It was a letter dated 1858, and it was addressed to Eleanor Vance. The handwriting was a careful, elegant script. It was a woman's hand. My dearest Eleanor, I received your last letter. Your work is a masterpiece. The garden is growing as planned. The soil you sent me is exceptional. He will not suspect a thing. I am so proud of you. Your loving sister, Agatha. The letter was a punch to the gut. Agatha, one of the sisters who had died young. The letter mentioned a garden, exceptional soil, and a chillingly casual tone about a man's impending death. The garden wasn't a place for flowers. It was a plot of land where she would bury her victims. The soil was a macabre euphemism for the poisoned earth, a deadly heirloom to be passed down. The horror deepened. Eleanor Vance wasn't a lone killer. She was a part of a family with a shared, terrible secret. The letter from Agatha confirmed their suspicion. This was a multi-generational conspiracy, a legacy of murder. But why? What was the debt Margaret Sterling had mentioned? Riley and Lena continued their search, now with a laser focus on the family of Eleanor Vance. They found obituaries for both Eleanor's sisters, Agatha and Beatrice. The causes of death were listed as fever and consumption, common diagnoses for illnesses caused by poisoning in the 19th century. Thorne had marked their names with the symbol of a broken heart. He hadn't just been researching the killer widow, he had been researching her family, her motive, and their victims. Their search led them to an old, weathered family Bible tucked away on a dusty shelf. Thorne had marked several passages, but one in particular stood out. It was a verse from Genesis, but Thorne had added a small cryptic note in the margin, a debt for a debt, sown in the earth. The phrase, sown in the earth, echoed Margaret Sterling's chilling words. But the most significant discovery was yet to come. Tucked between the pages of the Bible was a single brittle photograph. It was a family portrait taken in the late 1850s. A stern-faced man with a full beard stood in the center, flanked by 2 younger women, both with the same sharp, intelligent eyes as the woman in the locket. And on the man's lap, a young girl, no older than 10, sat with a small, solemn expression. Thorne had scrawled a name beneath the photograph, a name that made Riley's blood run cold. Elias Thorne, great-grandfather, a survivor. The man in the photograph wasn't a stranger. He was Elias Thorne's great-grandfather, but he wasn't a victim. He was part of the Vance family. This was the debt Margaret had mentioned. The Thorne family wasn't a victim of Eleanor Vance. They were her accomplices. Elias Thorne wasn't just a historian digging up a dark secret. He was a descendant of the very family who had orchestrated the killings. He had been trying to expose his own family's terrible legacy. The new knowledge changed everything. Thorne's disappearance wasn't a coincidence. He hadn't stumbled upon the killer widow's secret. He had been born into it. His final frantic words, "She's here. I think she knows I'm getting too close," took on a new, terrifying meaning. He wasn't talking about a ghost from the past. He was talking about a descendant, an heir to the Vance family legacy of murder. And now Riley and Lena were standing in the same line of fire. They were no longer just detectives. They were now witnesses to a legacy of murder that had just chosen its next victim. The revelation that Elias Thorne was a descendant of Eleanor Vance's family, and that his disappearance was a result of this dark legacy, sent a jolt of urgency through Riley and Lena. Their investigation shifted from a cold case to an active hunt for a killer who was operating in the present, a killer who had inherited not only a twisted sense of purpose, but also a chilling modus operandi. They knew the what and the how, but the who was still a mystery. Who was the modern-day heir to the killer widow? Their immediate focus was the map Thorne had left behind, the small marked plots of land. They were scattered throughout Blackwood and the surrounding towns, a sinister trail of planted death. Riley and Lena decided to visit the closest one, a small, overgrown parcel of land on the edge of town, just a stone's throw from an old, abandoned mill. The land was a desolate, marshy patch, its soil dark and heavy with moisture. It was overgrown with weeds and brambles, and a few stunted trees cast long, gnarled shadows. As they walked through the tall grass, a strange, sickly sweet scent filled the air, a scent that was at once floral and metallic. It was an unnatural smell, a perfume of decay. "Look at this," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. She knelt down, pushing aside a tangled mess of vines. There, partially hidden by the undergrowth, was a small, crudely carved headstone. It was unmarked, a blank slab of stone, but at the base, a single, withered plant struggled for life. It was a type of nightshade, its black, poisonous berries shriveled and dry. A cold dread settled in Riley's stomach. This was the garden from the letter. This was where Eleanor Vance had buried her victims. The blank headstones were a chilling detail. It wasn't about public remembrance, it was about a private, terrible record. The earth itself was a part of the crime. She wasn't just killing them, Riley said, his voice thick with revulsion. She was planting them, literally. The thought was grotesque, but it made a terrible kind of sense. The soil her sister had mentioned, the debt. The victims were not just bodies to be disposed of. They were seeds for a new, dark crop. The land was a part of the twisted legacy, a macabre monument to the Vance family's vendetta. As they moved on, they found another blank headstone, and another. Each one was marked by a dying nightshade plant. The macabre trail led them to the old mill, its windows shattered and its wooden frame rotting away. The mill had been a thriving business in the 19th century, owned by a wealthy industrialist named Frederick Vance. Riley felt a jolt of recognition. Vance. The name from Thorne's family tree. Frederick Vance had been a man of power and influence in Blackwood. Thorne's notes mentioned that he had used his wealth and connections to build a small empire, and in the process he had ruined a number of local families, including a rival mill owner and his 2 young sons. The notes were sparse, but the details were chilling. The rival family, the Sterling family, had been driven into ruin and poverty. Their land was seized by Frederick Vance, and the two sons had vanished, their disappearance a whispered about mystery in the town for over a century. A terrible realization dawned on Riley. The debt. It wasn't about money or revenge for a single slight. It was about a family vendetta that had been passed down through generations. Frederick Vance had ruined the Sterling family. Eleanor, as a member of the Vance family, was paying a terrible price. She was taking her revenge, not on Frederick, but on the men of her own family, the men who had benefited from his actions. The men she had murdered were all descendants of the Vance family, or men who had been associated with Frederick Vance's business. The two survivors, Daniel Sterling and Jacob Finch, were the exceptions, the lucky ones who had escaped her twisted legacy. The horror was compounded when they discovered Thorne's last known location. He had been seen at the old mill, talking to a reclusive woman who lived in a small, renovated cottage nearby. The cottage was owned by an heir to the Vance family. The name on the deed, Julia Vance. Riley and Lena approached the cottage with caution. It was a modern, well-kept house, a stark contrast to the dilapidated mill. A young woman with a long braid and a kind, friendly face answered the door. She introduced herself as Julia Vance. She was a gentle, unassuming person, a librarian by trade. She was everything they didn't expect. They questioned her about Thorne's visit. She was cooperative, but nervous. She confirmed that Thorne had been there. "He came to me with questions about my family," she said, her voice soft and shaky. "He said he was a distant relative, that he was writing a book about the history of Blackwood. He asked me about my great-aunt, Eleanor Vance. He said she was a free spirit." The lie hung in the air. Eleanor Vance was a murderer. Julia Vance knew it, and her calm demeanor was a terrifying facade. When Riley mentioned the family property, the garden, her eyes flickered with a brief, almost imperceptible panic. Riley knew they were getting closer. He also knew they were walking on a thin wire. "We found a locket at Thorne's office," Riley said, pulling it from his pocket. "We believe it belonged to Eleanor Vance. We wanted to know if you recognized it." Julia's eyes widened, a flash of fear and hatred in them. She didn't answer. She simply stared at the locket, her hands clasped tightly together. It was then that Riley noticed the small dark stain on her sleeve. It was the rich, loamy color of the soil from the hidden garden, and the scent of nightshade was stronger here, a faint but unmistakable perfume that clung to her clothes. Julia Vance wasn't just a descendant, she was the modern-day heir to the killer widow. Thorne's final words echoed in Riley's mind, a chilling warning. "She's here. I think she knows I'm getting too close." He and Lena had just walked into the lion's den, and the lion was a quiet, unassuming librarian who was continuing a century-old legacy of murder. The air in Julia Vance's cottage felt heavy, electrified with unspoken dread. The polite facade she wore was cracking, revealing a chilling undercurrent of panic and malice. Riley and Lena knew they were in the presence of the modern-day killer widow, a woman who had meticulously continued a family legacy of murder. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning. The locket, the soil stain, and the overwhelming scent of nightshade. "We have reason to believe that Elias Thorne's disappearance is connected to your family's history," Riley said, his voice low and steady, a calculated probe. He was digging into the past, wasn't he? Uncovering things that were supposed to stay buried. Julia's hands trembled slightly. She took a step back, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice a thin, reedy sound. "My family is complicated. Elias was obsessed, but he didn't find anything. There's nothing to find." "We found the map, Julia," Lena said, her tone sharp and direct. The map of the plots of land. We found the gardens. We know what your family has been doing for over a century. The last vestiges of Julia's composure crumbled, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The gentle librarian was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating killer. It wasn't a choice, she spat, her voice laced with venom. It was a debt for a debt. Frederick Vance, my ancestor. He built his fortune on the destruction of others. He ruined families, drove them to madness and suicide. Our family name, our blood, it was tainted by his actions. Eleanor. She started the purge. She was cleansing the lineage, taking back what was owed. The debt was not a random vendetta. It was a macabre, generational justice. The murdered men were not random victims. They were descendants of the families that Frederick Vance had wronged. Eleanor Vance was a grim avenger, a twisted instrument of retribution. Her victims were collateral damage, a price to be paid for her ancestors' greed. Elias Thorne, a descendant of a family that had been spared in the 19th century, had stumbled upon the terrible truth. He was trying to expose the Vance family's dark past, a past that Julia had been chosen to protect. "So you continued it?" Riley asked, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're continuing her work. You killed Elias Thorne." Julia let out a cold, humorless laugh. Elias was a fool. He was so caught up in the history. He didn't see the present. He was so busy looking for the past, he walked right into the future. He thought he was a detective. He was just another link in the chain. The confession hung in the air, a final, chilling piece of the puzzle. But Riley was a detective, and he knew that a confession wasn't enough. They needed to find the body. They needed to find Elias Thorne. And they needed to find the evidence that would tie Julia to the murders. "Where is he, Julia?" Riley asked, his voice now a command. Julia's smile was a terrifying display of pure malice. "He's where he belongs, in the garden. He's paying the debt he inherited." She moved with a sudden, startling speed, pulling a small plastic bag from her pocket. Inside was a handful of what looked like crushed plant matter, a dark, granular substance. She threw it in Riley's face. He reeled back, his eyes and nose stinging with a bitter, acrid scent. It was nightshade powder, a concentrated dose of the poison. He could feel its numbing effects almost instantly, a slow paralysis creeping through his limbs. Lena, ever vigilant, lunged at Julia, but the woman was surprisingly strong and fast. She grabbed a small, ornate dagger from a nearby table, a ceremonial artifact. It was a beautiful, ancient-looking weapon, and it had a chilling familiarity. It was the same design as a knife found in one of Thorne's historical books. Lena managed to wrestle the dagger from her, but Julia, in her desperation, pushed past her and bolted for the door. Riley, his vision blurring and his movements sluggish, could only watch as she disappeared into the fading afternoon light. Lena, with a deep breath, quickly assessed the situation. Riley was weak but conscious. The poison wasn't a lethal dose, but it was enough to incapacitate him. She knew they had to act fast. Julia Vance was now a fugitive, a murderer who had just escaped. "I'm calling this in," Lena said, her voice a clipped professional tone. "We need a full APB on Julia Vance, and we need to get you to the hospital." Riley, his body feeling like a dead weight, managed to shake his head. "No. The garden. She knows we're coming. She's not just running. She's going to move the body. She's going to destroy the evidence. We have to go there now." Lena hesitated for a moment. She was a professional. She knew the protocol, but she also knew that Riley was right. The body, the proof, was their only chance to connect the past to the present and stop the terrible legacy once and for all. She made a choice, a calculated risk. She didn't call for backup. She helped Riley to his feet, her arm wrapped around his waist, and they stumbled out into the fading light toward the old mill and the hidden, poisoned gardens. The past was catching up to the present, and they were caught in the middle. The race was on. The short distance from Julia Vance's cottage to the old mill felt like a marathon. The nightshade powder that Julia had thrown at Riley was a paralytic, not a lethal poison, but it was doing its job. His limbs felt heavy and unresponsive, a dull electric current coursing through his veins. Lena was his anchor, her arm wrapped around his waist, her strong, steady presence a shield against the creeping paralysis. The air was cold, a harsh reminder of the autumn chill that was setting in, but the fear that gripped them was a far more chilling sensation. As they approached the mill, the faint glow of a headlamp cut through the encroaching darkness. Julia. She was here. She was moving fast. The mill was a skeletal structure against the bruised twilight sky, its broken windows like the gaping eyes of a monster. The low, muffled sound of a shovel hitting the dirt echoed from the marshy land behind the building, a macabre sound of a killer at work. "She's in the garden," Riley whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. "We have to be careful. She's desperate." Lena nodded, her face a mask of grim determination. They moved with a practiced, silent efficiency, slipping through the tall, dead grass, their bodies hidden by the long shadows of the mill. They rounded the corner of the building, and the scene that unfolded before them was a terrifying tableau. Julia Vance was in the middle of a small, cleared patch of land. Her headlamp, a single searching beam of light. She was frantically digging, her movements frantic and clumsy. At her feet lay a dark canvas tarp. She was uncovering a freshly dug grave. The soil was a rich, dark loam, the same color as the stain on her clothes. A half-buried body was visible, its face pale and still in the headlamp's glare. Elias Thorne. The smell of death and nightshade was overwhelming, a toxic cloud that hung in the air. Julia, sensing their presence, stopped digging. She slowly stood up, turning to face them, the shovel clutched in her hands like a weapon. The single beam of light from her headlamp swept over them, catching them in its cold glare. "You came," she said, her voice a low, triumphant hiss. "I knew you would. You're just like him, so determined, so predictable." "It's over, Julia," Lena said, her voice firm. "We know everything. We know about the family legacy, the debt, the gardens. We know you killed Elias." Julia laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You know nothing. You only see the end. You don't see the beginning, the pain, the suffering. The debt had to be paid. My family was sick. He was sick. And I was the cure." She took a step toward them, the shovel held high. The desperation in her eyes was palpable. She wasn't just a murderer. She was a true believer in a century-old family-sanctioned vendetta. She was a fanatic, and fanatics are the most dangerous kind of enemy. Riley, despite the paralysis creeping through his limbs, knew they couldn't just stand there. He had to create a distraction. He reached into his pocket, his fingers fumbling for the locket. He held it up, the silver catching the moonlight in a brief, desperate flash. "This locket, Julia," he said, his voice strained. "Thorne's great-grandmother gave this to him. She knew what was happening. She wanted to expose you. She wanted the debt to end." The sight of the locket was a shock to Julia. Her eyes widened, a flicker of genuine confusion and hurt flashing across her face. "No," she stammered. "That's a lie. My family would never. We were doing the right thing. The men, they deserved it. They were tainted. It was the opening they needed." Lena moved fast and silent, her movements a blur in the darkness. She closed the distance between them, and with a swift, professional move, she disarmed Julia, yanking the shovel from her hands and sending it flying into the tall grass. Julia screamed, a primal sound of rage and despair. She lunged at Lena, her hands clawing, her movements fueled by a psychotic sense of mission. Lena, a seasoned professional, sidestepped the attack and used a non-lethal submission hold, bringing Julia down to the wet, cold ground. Julia fought and thrashed, a wild animal caught in a trap, her frantic movements a stark contrast to the quiet, methodical professionalism of Lena. Riley, his body now almost completely numb, finally stumbled to the ground, a wave of nausea washing over him. The sight of Julia, defeated and in custody, was a bitter triumph. The killer widow's legacy had ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The chain of murder was broken. As the police sirens wailed in the distance, a sound that was at once a relief and a sorrow, Riley lay on the cold, wet ground, looking up at the sky. The stars were out, a cold, indifferent audience to the human drama that had just unfolded. The truth of the matter was far more terrifying than any ghost story. The real monsters weren't specters from the past. They were people, driven by a twisted sense of justice and a legacy of hate. The horror wasn't in the supernatural, it was in the human heart. And the greatest horror of all was that it had gone unchecked for over a century, a terrible secret buried in the earth, waiting to be unearthed by a new generation. The aftermath was a whirlwind of sirens, flashing lights, and the grim professionalism of the state police. Julia Vance was taken into custody, her silence now a hardened, defiant mask. The body of Elias Thorne was carefully exhumed, the cold, wet earth clinging to his clothes a chilling testament to his final moments. His death was a grim echo of the victims who had come before him, a final, terrible chapter in a book he had been so desperately trying to close. Riley, now in the sterile confines of a hospital room, was slowly recovering. The nightshade poison was a powerful paralytic, but it was not lethal in the dose he had received. He was weak, his muscles still sluggish, but his mind was sharp and clear. Lena sat by his bedside, her presence a comforting constant. She was the one who had seen it through, the one who had made the call, who had ensured that Julia Vance was apprehended and that the evidence was secured. "She's not talking," Lena said, her voice tired but resolute. "She's retained a lawyer. They're pleading insanity. They'll use the family legacy as a defense, claiming she was mentally coerced by a generational curse." Riley sighed, a long, weary sound. He knew the playbook. The killer who pleads insanity is a common trope, but in this case, it held a terrifying ring of truth. Julia Vance wasn't a classic killer. She was a fanatic, a true believer in a twisted code of justice. "What about the other body?" Riley asked, referring to the second one they had uncovered in the garden. "We found another one," Lena said, her expression grim. "A man named Arthur Finch, a distant relative of Jacob Finch, the other survivor from the 19th century. He was reported missing 6 months ago. Julia had been living in Blackwood for 2 years. He was her first victim." The discovery of the second body solidified the case against Julia. She was a serial killer, a modern-day heir to the killer widow. The pattern was identical: a targeted victim, a quick, silent death, and a macabre burial in the family garden. Riley's mind went back to the 2 survivors, Daniel Sterling and Jacob Finch. Their escape wasn't a coincidence. They were the ones who had broken the chain. They had been the ones who had seen the truth, the ones who had refused to be a part of the terrible legacy. "We need to find the descendants of Daniel Sterling and Jacob Finch," Riley said, his voice raspy. "Julia must have been targeting them. They could be in danger." Lena was already on it. She had a list of names, a family tree she had painstakingly constructed from Thorne's notes and her own research. They started with the Finch family. The last known descendant was a man named Michael Finch, a successful architect living in Boston. They contacted Michael Finch and arranged to meet with him. He was a sharp, professional man, but he was visibly shaken when they explained the purpose of their visit. He had no knowledge of his family's history, of the killer widow, or of the debt. His great-great-grandfather, Jacob Finch, had been a quiet, unassuming man, a farmer who had left Blackwood and never looked back. "My family," Michael said, his voice tight with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "They never spoke about the past. My grandfather always said that our roots were in Boston, that Blackwood was a place we had to leave behind. He said it was a town of ghosts, and that some ghosts were best left to sleep." The cryptic message from the past was a warning, a desperate plea from a survivor who knew the terrible truth. Jacob Finch had escaped with his life, but he had lived in constant fear, a fear that had been passed down through generations. He hadn't told his family the truth, but he had instilled in them a sense of caution, an unspoken code to stay away from the darkness that had once threatened to consume them. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that gave a terrifying context to the entire story, came from a journal Michael Finch had discovered in an old trunk. It was Jacob Finch's personal diary. The entries were a chilling first-hand account of his brief courtship with Eleanor Vance. "She was like a queen among commoners," Jacob had written. But there was a coldness in her eyes, a hunger. "She asked me about my family, my lineage, my history. She had a dark interest in the ruin of the Sterling family. She said that a great injustice had been done. She said that a terrible debt was owed. I was frightened. I didn't know why, but I knew I had to run. I saw her in the garden one day, a small patch of nightshade growing in a dark corner of her yard. She was tending to it as if it were a beautiful, fragile flower. Her hands were stained with dirt, but her eyes were filled with a terrible satisfaction. I knew then that she was not a woman, she was a poison, and I was the next victim on her list." The entry was a window into the mind of a survivor. Jacob Finch had seen the truth. He had seen the manipulation, the coldness, the obsession with a debt that was not his to pay. He had seen the poison, and he had run. He had saved himself, but in doing so, he had become a part of the terrible legacy, a ghost of a man who had narrowly escaped a family of monsters. Riley closed the journal, the weight of the story heavy in his hands. It was a terrifying tale of human cruelty, of a family who had turned murder into a sacred duty. The killer widow wasn't a legend. She was a real person, a part of a real family, and her terrible legacy was a warning that the past is never truly dead. It is buried, waiting to be unearthed by the next generation, ready to claim its next victim. The arrest of Julia Vance and the discovery of Elias Thorne's body marked the end of an active investigation. But for Riley and Lena, the psychological toll was just beginning. They had a killer in custody and a mountain of evidence, but the true horror of the case lay in its generational scope. The killer widow wasn't just a murderer, she was a legacy, a twisted tradition that had spanned over a century. As the case moved toward prosecution, Riley and Lena turned their attention to the last vestiges of Elias Thorne's life, his family, his will. They met with Thorne's niece Clara at his lawyer's office. She was pale and visibly shaken, the grief for her uncle still raw. "I can't believe it," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "My uncle was a gentle man. He was so excited about his research. He said he was going to expose a great truth." "He did, Miss Thorne," Riley said softly. "He exposed a terrible one." The lawyer, a staid professional man, opened the will. Elias Thorne had been a meticulous man, and his last will and testament was a reflection of his obsession. He had left his entire estate to his niece Clara, but with a series of strange and specific instructions. First, he had left a large sum of money to a trust, to be used for the restoration of the Historical Society. He had specified that a plaque be placed in his name, a plaque that would read, "In memory of the victims of the great injustice." Second, he had left his entire collection of historical documents, including his research on the Vance family, to the trust. He had stipulated that the documents be made public, to be studied by historians and the public. He had wanted the truth to be known, to be a part of the historical record, to never again be buried. Third, and most chillingly, he had left a single small package to his niece, Clara. It was a locket, a replica of the one they had found in his office. He had a small note with it. "My dearest Clara, I am sorry. I have put you in danger. But the truth must be known. The locket is a reminder. The debt has been paid. Now you must choose. You must choose to break the chain. Do not hide from our past. Expose it. And if you ever find yourself in a position of great power or influence, remember the story of the Sterling family. Remember the debt. And do not make the same mistake. You are the last link. You are the final hope." Clara broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. The weight of her uncle's secret was a heavy burden to bear. She was not a part of the past. She was a part of the future. She was the one who had to break the cycle. She was the last link in a chain of violence that had spanned over a century. As they left the lawyer's office, Lena looked at Riley. He knew, didn't he? He knew he was in danger. He knew he was the next victim. But he didn't run. He stayed. He chose to expose the truth, to pay the debt in his own way. "He was a historian, Lena," Riley said, his voice a low rumble. "He understood history. He knew that if he ran, the cycle would continue. He knew that the only way to stop it was to expose it. He chose to be a victim, to be a martyr. And in doing so, he saved countless lives. The final act of Elias Thorne was not one of cowardice or fear. It was one of courage, of a deep and abiding belief in the power of truth. He had seen the pattern, and he had chosen to break it. He had chosen to be the final victim, the last link in a chain of violence that had stretched across time. The story was now complete. The killer widow had been exposed. Her modern-day heir was in custody. The terrible generational debt had been paid, not with murder but with truth. But the story would live on. It would be told and retold, a grim cautionary tale. The story of a family of killers. The story of a man who chose to expose them, and in doing so paid the ultimate price. The story of a legacy that was finally broken. Months passed, and the quiet town of Blackwood, Massachusetts, returned to a semblance of normalcy. The trial of Julia Vance was a media spectacle, a national news story that brought the chilling details of the killer widow to a wider audience. The prosecution, armed with Elias Thorne's meticulous research, the photographic evidence of the gardens, and the journal of Jacob Finch, had a powerful case. Julia's insanity plea was quickly dismissed. She was a calculating, cold-blooded killer, not a victim of a generational curse. She was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. The story of Eleanor Vance and her terrible legacy of murder was now a part of the public record, a grim historical footnote in the annals of American crime. Elias Thorne, once a forgotten historian, was now a celebrated hero, a man who had sacrificed his life to expose a terrible truth. His plaque was placed at the Historical Society, a simple brass plate that told a simple truth, in memory of the victims of the great injustice. Riley and Lena, now a recognized team, were promoted. They were no longer just detectives. They were the ones who had unraveled a century-old mystery, the ones who had stopped a family legacy of murder. But the case had left a mark on them. The horror wasn't in the poison or the violence. It was in the human heart, in the twisted generational hatred that had led a family to murder in the name of justice. 1 year later, Riley and Lena returned to Blackwood. It was a quiet, autumn day, the air crisp and cold, a stark contrast to the humid summer air that had marked the beginning of their investigation. They were there for a simple reason: to visit Clara Thorne. Clara had dedicated her life to her uncle's work. She had taken his will to heart. She had become a guardian of the truth. She had used the trust to restore the historical society, and she had meticulously catalogued and digitized her uncle's research, making it available to anyone who wanted to know the story. The small, unassuming historical society had become a museum of human cruelty, a grim testament to the fact that some stories should never be forgotten. They found Clara in the archives, a quiet, serious young woman, poring over a new set of historical documents. She had a new purpose, a new mission. She was no longer just a niece grieving her uncle. She was a protector of the truth, a new link in a chain that was now dedicated to peace, not violence. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice soft. I wanted to show you something." She led them to a quiet corner of the archives, to a small glass display case. Inside was a single simple object, the locket that had belonged to Eleanor Vance. It was now a part of the historical record, a symbol of a dark past. Beside it was a small, elegant sign. The locket of Eleanor Vance, also known as the Killer Widow. A symbol of a generational legacy of murder that was brought to light by the courage of Elias Thorne. Riley looked at it, the small silver object, and felt a sense of closure. The mystery was gone. The questions had been answered. The human horror had been exposed. The locket was no longer a chilling mystery. It was a historical artifact, a warning to future generations. As they left the historical society, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in a riot of orange and purple. The town of Blackwood, with its quiet streets and picturesque New England charm, was no longer a stage for a monster. It was just a town, a place where people lived and died, and where stories were told. But the stories that were told now were different. They were about the human heart, about the dangers of hate, and about the power of truth. The story of the Killer Widow was now a part of Blackwood's history, a grim, cautionary tale that reminded everyone that some ghosts are not supernatural. They are human, and the only way to defeat them is to expose them, to bring them out of the darkness and into the light. Riley and Lena got into their car and drove away, leaving Blackwood behind. They had done their job. They had solved the case. But the memories, the chilling details, and the grim reality of the human capacity for evil would stay with them forever. The Killer Widow was gone, but her legacy lived on. A legacy of truth, a legacy of courage, and a legacy that reminded them that the real horror is never in the supernatural. It is always, always in the human heart.